born so ugly and abandoned by her parents. 20 years later, the girl.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch the video.
The feeble cries of a child echoed throughout the spacious delivery room of an upscale private hospital in New York. Isabella Montgomery, an aristocratic woman, lay on her hospital bed. Sweat glistened on her forehead, but her eyes shone with anticipation. After many years of waiting, she had finally given birth to a child. Richard Aldridge, her husband, stood nearby with his hands in his pockets, maintaining his cold demeanor. To him, having another child was simply an obligation to continue the prestigious Aldridge family line. When the nurse brought the baby closer to Isabella, she smiled. But that smile instantly froze when her eyes fell upon the baby's face. "Oh my God!" Isabella cried out, pushing the baby away as if it were a monster. Young nurse Maria stepped back, nearly dropping the baby. She was shocked. "What's wrong, Senora?" she asked, worried.
Isabella did not answer immediately. She only stared intently at the baby's face, then buried her head in her hands, her voice filled with panic. Richard stepped forward, frowning as he looked at the baby. On the baby's small face was a large, dark red birthmark, stretching from the forehead down to the left cheek, a mark that looked like a diabolical sign. Richard sneered. "A hideous child like this carrying the Aldridge name? This is an insult." Isabella trembled as she clutched her husband's hand tightly. "Richard, we cannot keep it. A child like this will destroy our family's reputation." Maria was stunned. "But ma'am, this is your daughter." Richard glared at the nurse. "You have no right to speak. Get out immediately." Helpless, Maria clutched the baby in her arms as she watched Isabella and Richard debate the child's fate as if it were not their own flesh and blood. Isabella shuddered, glancing around, her voice nearly in shambles. "Richard, do whatever you must, but I don't ever want to see it again for a single second." Richard waved his hand to order his most trusted servant, Manuel, a middle-aged man who had served the Aldridge family for decades. "Take it away. Make sure it disappears. Forever." Maria gasped. "Sir, this is a crime. You can't do this to a child." Richard smirked. "A crime? Then letting it live, showing that face everywhere and disgracing my family. Isn't that a crime?" Tears streamed down Maria's cheeks as she saw Manuel reluctantly nod and step forward to take the baby. The young nurse could do nothing but watch the unfortunate child being swept into a cold, dark night, while its parents felt nothing but revulsion. Manuel, wrapping the baby in an old woolen blanket, silently left the vast estate. He did not want to do this, but his master's orders could not be defied. He walked through long streets, trying not to hear the baby's faint cries in his arms. He knew full well he couldn't take the girl to an orphanage. Richard had ordered that no one should know of the child's existence. When he reached the edge of an outlying forest, Manuel hesitated. The baby still cried, its face flushed red from the cold. "Lord, forgive me," he murmured, setting the baby down on a large rock before turning away. But fate was not entirely cruel. An elderly woman named Mrs. Rose, who lived alone in a small wooden house near the forest and went to town daily to sell vegetables for a living, happened to pass by. When she heard the crying, she trembled and stepped closer. Heavens above, who would abandon a baby in such a freezing forest? She bent down, her aged eyes filled with compassion as she saw the abandoned newborn, its face marked with a red birthmark, like a faded sign. "Poor child, you must be so hungry and cold now." She gently picked up the baby, soothing it. As if sensing the warmth, the baby stopped crying. Its tiny eyes opened wide as it looked at Mrs. Rose. "Does no one want to care for you? Then I will take care of you." She held the baby tightly to her chest, wrapped it carefully in a woolen blanket to keep it warm, and slowly made her way back to her small house in the forest. Mrs. Rose's modest house was cozy. She lit a fire in the stove and carefully laid the baby on a bed. "Don't worry, my dear. Now you're safe," she whispered. Sitting down, she stroked the baby's thin hair and softly said, "I will name you Lucy, which means light, so that throughout your life, you will never have to live in darkness again." The next morning, Mrs. Rose carried Lucy into town to buy some milk. When she stepped into the grocery store, cold stares immediately fell upon her. Mrs. Marilyn, a stern middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, said, "Rose, where did you get that baby?
I found her in the forest. Someone abandoned her, Mrs. Rose replied firmly. I will raise her. The villagers began to murmur and gossip. Old man Albert shook his head. Look at that birthmark on her face. It might be a bad omen indeed. Mrs. Camille whispered. Do you think she is cursed? Mrs. Rose tightened her hold on Lucy. She's just a poor, unfortunate child. You all are so superstitious. Sergio, a young man from the village with crossed arms standing by, said, Honestly, Mrs. Rose, you'd better get rid of her. Keeping her around will only bring trouble upon you. Mrs. Rose paid no heed to the disparaging remarks. She held Lucy close and walked on, head held high. Say what you will. As for me, I will raise this child to be a proper person. The first days of Lucy's new life passed in the gentle warmth and care bestowed by Mrs. Rose. The small wooden house at the edge of the forest was the only place where the little girl was welcomed. Every morning, Rose would wake early, stoke the fire, cook porridge, and gently rouse Lucy with the warm, steady voice of a devoted grandmother. Lucy grew day by day, becoming smart, well-behaved, and deeply grateful to the one who saved her life. Yet the world outside that wooden house was not as warm as the glow of the stove. The villagers never forgot the deep red birthmark on the girl's face. Stretching from her forehead down to her cheek, the mark they called the demon sign, the curse, a bad omen. The disdainful stares began from the very first day Mrs. Rose carried Lucy into town for milk. From Mrs. Marilyn, a strict middle-aged woman with a piercing cold gaze, to old man Albert, who always shook his head whenever he saw Lucy passing by. Then to Mrs. Camille, who used to be Rose's close friend, but had kept her distance ever since Rose took Lucy in. And Sergio, a gruff young man who would seize any opportunity to assert, keeping that child is just inviting trouble upon yourself. Every time Rose carried Lucy into town to buy a few necessities, hushed whispers would follow behind them like thin, cutting blades. That's the cursed child. That little girl surely brings bad luck. Look at that mark, like congealed blood, so horrifying. Surely Rose must be out of her mind to raise her. Lucy gradually realized that the world outside was nothing like the storybooks Mrs. Rose read to her at night. When Lucy learned to walk, every step toward the market made her little heart tighten. The other children would always avoid her. Some even shouted, "You're a monster! Look at your face!" Then they ran away, leaving behind mocking laughter. Lucy would often lower her head, clutching Mrs. Rose's hand tightly, her small fingers white with tension. Her eyes were full of questions, but she dared not speak them aloud. Mrs. Rose understood. She sensed every glance and heard every murmur. Yet she always held Lucy's hand firmly and said, "You've done nothing wrong, Lucy. They are superstitious. Just be yourself, good, obedient, and diligent, and one day they will understand." Lucy looked up, her clear eyes fixed on her. "If I study hard, will they love me?" "Grandma?" Rose paused for a moment. She patted her granddaughter's head gently and said softly, "Not everyone is kind, my dear, but if you gain knowledge, you will have the strength to protect yourself. And who knows, you might just change this whole world." Lucy did not fully understand what Rose said, but she nodded. In her tender mind, knowledge was light, just like the name Lucy that Rose had given her. Time passed. Lucy grew older. The village where they lived remained small and impoverished, yet rich in prejudice. Ever since Rose had taken Lucy in, the pair were the main subject of gossip in the market. "That child should have been left in the forest. I bet she brings misfortune. Ever since she came to town, the harvests have been terrible. Rose doesn't look so well these days. It must be because she's raising a cursed child." Lucy heard it all. Though she tried to act indifferent, her tender heart could not help but ache. Every time she went to the market, she lowered her head. Every time she heard laughter at her expense, she clenched her fists. A question kept echoing in Lucy's heart. Why do they hate me? What did I do wrong? When Lucy turned 8, a deep longing arose within her to go to school like the other children. She had quietly observed them every morning, watching their cheerful steps toward the village school. She imagined herself wearing an old uniform, sitting in a classroom, hearing the teacher call her name. One morning, gathering all her courage, Lucy took Mrs. Rose's hand and looked up. "Grandma, may I go to school?" Rose hesitated, looking at the little girl with uncertainty. "Lucy, I'm afraid they won't accept you." But I can already read. I will study very hard. I promise. Rose looked into those burning, hopeful eyes and knew she could not refuse. The next morning, Rose took Lucy to the village school gate. But as soon as they stepped into the campus, a group of parents blocked the classroom door. Their faces were tense and indignant. Mrs. Marissa, her voice grating, said, "We will not let our children study with a cursed child." "That's right," boomed Mr. Albert. "Who knows what misfortune that child will bring to the class?" Lucy trembled and hid behind Mrs. Rose, her eyes brimming with tears. Principal Peter stepped out from inside, sighing with a hoarse voice from reluctance. "Rose, I'm very sorry, but you see, there's nothing I can do." Mrs. Rose trembled with anger. "She's just a child. Don't you have any conscience?" Yet the crowd remained cold, not one of them showing any regret. In the end, Rose had no choice. She turned and led Lucy away under the icy stairs. That night, Lucy did not eat. The little girl curled up in a corner of the house, her small hands clutching a blanket, whispering, "Am I really that detestable, Grandma?" Rose sat beside her, holding Lucy tightly. With a choked voice, she said softly, "No, my dear, you are more precious to me than anyone in this village. They may not see it, but I do, and I will never let them take away your self-belief." From that day on, Lucy no longer mentioned school. Yet every morning, she would wake early, sweep the house, help Rose stoke the fire, and then sit to read the old books that Mrs. Rose had managed to keep. Every new vocabulary word, every simple arithmetic problem, every fairy tale became the world that Lucy escaped into to avoid the disdainful eyes outside. Lucy learned everything with passion. Rose taught her from the little that she knew: addition and subtraction, the alphabet, and how to write her name. Every evening, the grandmother and granddaughter sat under the faint glow of an oil lamp, reading a story together. And before sleep, Rose always said, "You do not need the acceptance of the cruel, Lucy. They do not decide your fate." And Lucy would nod quietly. No one could see it, but in her eyes burned a silent, enduring flame. The world outside remained unchanged. The villagers still whispered whenever they saw the two of them. The children still mocked Lucy. One day, while the pair were at the market buying vegetables, Lucy encountered Anthony Aldridge, the only son of the family who had abandoned her years ago. Anthony, about 10 years old at the time, handsome and arrogant, sneered when he saw Lucy. "Who are you?" Lucy stuttered. I'm Lucy." Anthony paused and then burst into laughter. "Oh, so you're the monster child that was discarded, right?" Lucy lowered her head, her heart aching, but did not reply. Anthony turned to his group of friends and pointed. "Look here, this is the cursed girl. Stay away from her if you don't want bad luck." The other children laughed uproariously. A boy named James mocked, "Ugly Lucy, you're the bad omen for the whole village." Lucy ran home as fast as she could. Her tears mingled with the cold wind. She did not cry loudly, but each tear fell silently, hot with sorrow. That night Rose asked softly, "What did they do to you?" Lucy shook her head, her eyes red. Rose needed no further words. She simply hugged the little girl, gently ruffling her tangled hair. "You don't need them. One day you will show them." Lucy said nothing, but inside her, a seed of defiance began to sprout. Winter in the American mountain region was bitterly cold. The winds blew through the barren trees, slipping through every rotten crevice of the small house where Mrs. Rose and Lucy lived. That winter was particularly harsh, and it was also the last winter of Mrs. Rose's life. She had grown much older. Her once neatly tied silver hair now often lay disheveled on her shoulders every morning when she woke with a persistent cough. Her sleep was no longer deep. It was often fitful and interrupted. But no matter how tired she was, she still tried to wake up, still cooked porridge, still swept the yard, and still neatly folded the old blanket that Lucy used to cover herself with. Lucy noticed the changes in her. Her steps had grown slower, her hands trembled more when carrying a boiling pot of water, and her voice had grown much weaker. The eyes that once shone brightly with trust were now shrouded in a weary, misty layer. One night, as Rose cradled Lucy in her arms as always to lull her to sleep, Lucy hesitated for a long moment before whispering, "Grandma, are you all right?"
Rose gently stroked the little girl's hair, her voice soft, yet with breaks in her breath. "I'm fine. Old age just makes me a little tired. It's nothing, my dear." But Lucy did not believe her. The little girl had seen the red streaks of blood on the handkerchief that Rose used to hide behind her pillow. She had seen her tremble as she struggled to get out of bed on those cold mornings. And above all, Lucy felt an ever-growing sense of unease in her heart. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, Lucy decided to do something. Though she was only 11 years old, inside her swelled a strong urge. She had to save her grandmother. She had to do something. She had to earn money to buy medicine. Silently, Lucy folded her own knitted scarf, put on her thin cloak, and then left the house. The biting wind struck her face, but Lucy did not stop. She hurried along the dew-covered dirt road, going to every house in the village, knocking on doors with her cold, numb hands and pleading eyes. "Please give me a job. Anything will do. I need money to buy medicine for my grandmother." The responses Lucy received were only disdainful looks and firmly closed doors. Mrs. Marissa crossed her arms, tilted her chin high, and said in a raised voice, "You want to work in my house? Never. I will not let misfortune step through my door." Mr. Albert, with a face as cold as ice, shook his head. "Do you really think someone would hire a cursed child like you?" Lucy bit her lip, trying to hold back the tears that were about to burst forth. She continued to knock on the doors of bakeries, inns, vegetable stalls. But everywhere she went, she only received rejections, ridicule, fearful and scornful looks. Her small legs began to tremble, not only from the cold, but from exhaustion. Yet she still struggled to hobble back home. Her two little hands were empty, and her heart was heavy. When she opened the creaking wooden door of the house, Rose was lying on the bed, curled up under the blanket, hacking harshly. She could not eat, could not sit up, only lying there weakly breathing. Her eyes were deeply sunken, and her skin was pallid. Lucy knelt by the bed, took her grandmother's thin, icy hands in hers. She tried to smile, but her voice trembled. "Grandma, I need to see a doctor. You need medicine. Please don't sleep, you must stay with me." Rose slowly opened her eyes, her gaze tender but tired. She frowned slightly, then gave a forced smile. "It's all right. As long as you're by my side, that is enough." But Lucy did not accept that. She ran out of the house to Mrs. Camille's, the woman who had once been Rose's close friend, frantically knocking on the door, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Camille, please. I have nowhere else to go. Help me, please." After a long while, the door opened. But instead of the warm eyes Lucy had hoped for, she only saw a cold and distant face. Camille crossed her arms, her voice weary. "Lucy, you must understand that no one wants to get involved in your business. Rose is gone. I cannot risk helping you. I am sorry." Then the door closed decisively. Lucy stood there, tears streaming down. She ran throughout the village, going from house to house, from shop to shop. No one opened their door. No one helped. No one even deigned to look at her. She sought out the village doctor, pleading, "Please, doctor, please save my grandmother. I will work to repay you. I promise." The doctor looked at the little girl and shook his head. "Your grandmother's illness requires expensive medicine. Without money, there's nothing I can do." Lucy collapsed. The wind howled in her ears. The gray sky hung like a funeral shroud. The little girl ran home and collapsed beside Rose's bed. That night, the wind whistled through the old roof. Rose lay on the bed, her eyes half awake and half dreaming. Lucy sat beside her, clutching her hand, trying to keep her alert. "Grandma, please don't sleep. I need you. I don't want to be left alone. I will do everything. I promise." Rose slowly opened her eyes, her voice a soft, weak whisper. "Lucy,
You are the most beautiful light in my life." Tears streamed down Lucy's face.
"I don't want that light to go out. Please, Grandma, don't leave me." But Rose only smiled faintly. Her eyes closed.
Her breath gradually weakened, and then ceased entirely. Lucy stiffened. She touched her grandmother's face. It was cold and lifeless. There was no warmth. There was no heartbeat. She burst into tears, clutched the body of her departed grandmother tightly, and screamed in despair. Her cries tore through the night, mingling with the wailing winds outside. The next morning, news of Rose's death spread throughout the village. But instead of mourning, the villagers gossiped in voices filled with malicious satisfaction. Mr. Albert shrugged. "She should have abandoned that child long ago. Raising her only brought disaster." Mrs. Marissa nodded. "Now that she's dead, what about that child?" Another person shouted. "Get rid of her! No one wants to live near a cursed child." Lucy remained sitting beside Rose's body, her eyes swollen, her heart feeling squeezed. Suddenly, Anthony Aldridge appeared at the door. He stood there, arrogant, hands in his pockets, his eyes flashing with contempt. "So the old witch has finally died, huh?" Lucy looked up, her eyes red. "Don't say that," Anthony sneered. "Why not? I'm just speaking the truth. Now there's no one here to protect you. Do you really think you can survive?" Lucy clenched her fists, her fingernails digging into her flesh. "I will live. I will survive on my own. I don't need any pity from you or anyone." Anthony shrugged. "Suit yourself, but don't expect anyone in this village to help you." He turned and left, leaving Lucy sitting there, a solitary shadow in the cold wooden house. From that day on, Lucy officially became a ghost abandoned in the village. No one gave her food. No one offered her shelter. No one even deigned to speak her name. She had to scavenge for leftover pieces of bread, drink ice-cold water from a stream to survive. During the day, she wandered through the market, hoping someone might take pity on her. But every door was shut firmly as she approached. "Get out! We have no place for a monster." At night, Lucy curled up in a deserted corner of the market, hugging her knees tightly to keep warm. The wind howled through the layers of tattered fabric. Her stomach ached with hunger, but there was nothing to eat. No one reached out. The little orphan was completely alone. There was no more Rose. There was no one. She could no longer cry. There were no more tears. Only the cold, hunger, sorrow, and loneliness enveloped her tiny soul. Night fell over the old village in a cold, silent stillness. There was no rain, but the air was damp, heavy as if awaiting the rise of a storm. In a corner of the old market, where Lucy still quietly curled up every night, the little girl opened her eyes wide in the darkness, her breathing steady yet uneasy. She could no longer stay. This village no longer had a place for her, and if she waited another day, it might be her last. The taunting words, the disdainful stares, the kicks, the stones thrown, the slaps, the hunger, all had exceeded the limits that a small orphan child could bear. She gathered together all that remained of her life, a torn scarf, a piece of stale hard bread, and, most importantly, the small knife that Rose had given her when she was still alive. That knife was not meant to harm anyone, but to defend herself. Rose had once said, "In this world, you must protect yourself. There isn't always someone to stand up for you." Those words now echoed in Lucy's mind like a flickering light in the dark. When the clock struck midnight, she cautiously stepped out of the market. Her bare feet pounded along the rough, uneven dirt road, each step painful as sharp stones pricked her skin. But she did not stop. There was only one thought in her mind: to leave this place. The farther away, the better. Toward New York, the city that Rose had once mentioned, where Rose believed that people like her could begin a new life. Lucy walked through the silent streets, past the old church,
past the hill that once held a swing she had never had the chance to sit on. She did not look back. This village had nothing left to remember. There was no one to miss. When she reached the edge of the dense northern forest, the only way out of the village, her heart pounded. The night sky was filled with stars, but the forest was as dark as ink. She gripped the knife tightly inside her sleeve, swallowed hard once, and then stepped in. But fate would not let Lucy go so easily. Less than half an hour after she had slipped into the forest, a rustling sound behind her made her stop. A shadow, then two, then three. Her heart felt as if it would fall out of her chest as she recognized those familiar taunting voices. "Where are you hurrying off to, Lucy?" Anthony's voice rang out, as cold as a knife's edge. He stood there, flanked by his two friends, Daniel and Raphael. The three of them were like wolves stalking their prey, their eyes glinting with a cruel light in the darkness. Lucy stepped back, her hand clutching the knife in her pocket, but she did not dare draw it. She knew that the three of them were not only words, they were ready to use their hands, feet, or anything to hurt her. "Did you think you could sneak away without saying goodbye to us?" Raphael laughed loudly. Daniel stepped forward, but Anthony raised his hand to block him. He wanted to act alone. He advanced toward Lucy slowly, like a beast stalking its prey. When he was only a few steps away, he stopped, tilting his head. "Do you really think you'll survive out there? No one wants a monster like you. You don't belong anywhere." Lucy looked up and met Anthony's eyes. In the depths of her eyes was fear, but there was something else too. Defiance. Anthony frowned, dissatisfied. He raised his hand and slapped her hard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the silent forest, leaving a red mark imprinted on Lucy's cheek. But she did not fall. She did not cry. She only clenched her jaw tightly, holding back her tears. "Still not willing to submit?" he whispered, then suddenly grasped her chin tightly, forcing her to lift her face. "Look at me. Look at the one who has trampled on your life." Lucy gasped. Her eyes blazed, not from pain, but from a rising fury. In that moment, she recalled everything. The death of Rose, the days of hunger, the scornful looks, the stones, the wounds. And she acted. With all her might, she scooped a handful of damp earth and threw it straight into Anthony's face. He yelled, stumbling back, rubbing his eyes. Not wasting another second, Lucy kicked hard at his knee. Anthony staggered and fell. Daniel and Raphael were stunned for a moment, but Lucy turned and fled into the forest, running as if the entire world were chasing her. Shouts and the pounding of footsteps echoed behind. Anthony bellowed in anger, "Catch her! Don't let her escape!" Lucy ran through the forest, branches whipping her face, the rough ground tearing at her feet. But she did not stop. She could not. If she stopped, she would die. Ahead, the trees began to thin. A faint light appeared, the light of a road. And then she fell. Her knee scraped hard against the ground, gashing open, blood pouring out. She forced herself to lift her head and saw a carriage approaching. In the carriage was an old man with silver hair and a resolute face. Arnold, the coachman who transported goods between the village and the city. "What are you doing here at this hour?" His voice boomed, strong and alert. Lucy could only croak, "Please, save me. They're chasing me." Arnold looked at the little girl. Tattered clothes, bruised face, bloodied feet. His eyes suddenly sharpened. Then, from behind, Anthony and his two friends burst out of the forest, stopping in their tracks when they saw Arnold. "What's going on here?" he growled. Anthony stepped forward and sneered. "Nothing. Just a rat trying to flee." Arnold did not answer. He bent down, extended his hand toward Lucy. Get in." Lucy grasped his hand and was pulled into the carriage. Arnold tightened the reins. "Get out of here before I call the police." Anthony froze. He did not dare oppose Arnold, one of the few reputable men in the region. He gritted his teeth, his eyes filled with hatred as the carriage rolled away, carrying Lucy into the darkness. Lucy sat curled up in the corner of the carriage, panting, her heart still pounding unevenly. Arnold glanced back at her over his shoulder. "Who are you? Why are they chasing you like that?" She hesitated a moment before saying, "I am Lucy. They say I am cursed. I have no one. I just want to leave this place." Arnold was silent for a long stretch. When the carriage stopped at a rest station along the road, he turned back and placed a few coins into her hand. "You need to get to New York. Don't look back. It may not be easy there, but at least you will have a chance." Lucy stared at the coins in her hand, her throat constricted. For the first time in her life, someone had helped her, not out of pity, but because they saw her as a human being. She looked up at Arnold and whispered, "Thank you. I will never forget this." Arnold nodded. "Go now, and never let them lay a hand on you again." The carriage continued rolling, leaving the shadowed village behind. Lucy did not look back. She only gazed ahead, toward the faint light of the big city, where she would begin a new life. The dark journey in the village had ended, and a new chapter, a chapter called Hope, was just beginning. Lucy couldn't remember when she had fallen asleep on old Arnold's carriage. All she knew was that when she woke up, she saw the morning sunlight filtering through the dusty glass window, shining upon her bruised face and sun-tanned skin. Before her lay a vast, noisy, and completely unfamiliar city, New York. The cobblestone streets were crowded, filled with street vendors' cries, clattering horse-drawn carriages, and a cacophony of laughter that overwhelmed her. Lucy took a deep breath, savoring the new taste of freedom and fragile hope. Arnold handed her a few small coins, the only gift from a kind stranger. Lucy bowed her head in thanks, her eyes welling up. She knew she couldn't waste that help. After wandering for a while around the bustling streets without finding shelter, she ventured deep into the slums in the southern part of the city, where the poorest people crowded together to get by. The ramshackle houses stood side by side. Walls were worn and cracked, and garbage was strewn everywhere. But for Lucy, that was paradise, because here, perhaps, she wouldn't be turned away. Finally, Lucy knocked on the door of a cramped boarding house managed by an old woman named Stella. Stella was not friendly. Her wrinkled face and stern, penetrating eyes seemed capable of seeing into anyone's soul. "Do you have any money?" she asked as soon as she cracked the door open. Lucy nodded and produced the few remaining coins. "I just need a little corner to sleep. I'll work to pay for it," Stella huffed. But after a long moment of scrutinizing her, she agreed. "I don't give anything for free. If you want to stay here, you have to work. Wash dishes, clean up, whatever I tell you to do, you must do." Lucy did not hesitate. "Yes, I'm willing to do anything." That night, in a dim room that barely held a wooden board to sleep on and a thin blanket, Lucy curled up with her arms wrapped around her knees. The wind howled through the cracked window, but in her heart, for the first time in many years, there was not fear, but determination. She had made it here. She was still alive, and she would start over with everything she had. The next day, Lucy walked along the streets, inquiring about any available work. Eventually, someone directed her to a small school for poor children. The old school building, with its peeling plaster walls, still echoed with the laughter and playful running of children, something that made Lucy feel warm inside. She met the principal, Mr. Matthew, a middle-aged man with a thick beard and a stern yet not cold face. "What is it that you want?" he asked. Lucy stood up straight, her eyes resolute. "I want to learn. I don't have money for tuition, but I can work, sweep floors, clean the classrooms, anything, as long as you give me a chance." Mr. Matthew looked at her for a long time, then nodded. "If you are truly willing to work, then we are willing to let you study." That was the first turning point. From that day on, Lucy began a new life, more difficult than she had ever imagined, but also the first taste of hope she had ever grasped. Each day for her began before dawn. While other children were still fast asleep, Lucy would already be sweeping the hallways, scrubbing the toilets, and collecting trash from the classrooms. Her hands became calloused, her back ached, but she never complained. After finishing her work, she would quickly wash her face with cold water and sit in class with bright, eager eyes. Lucy learned not only with her mind, but with her heart and an indomitable will to live. She read every line of text as if swallowing every hope. She solved every math problem with breathless concentration. On nights back at the boarding house, under the faint glow of an oil lamp, Lucy would study until her eyes burned and her hands could write no more. Though her peers shunned her because of her unusual appearance and tattered clothes, Lucy paid them no mind. Every time she recalled the villagers' insulting words, the stones thrown, and the disdainful looks, she clenched her resolve even tighter. "I will not let anyone define me." Mr. Matthew, who initially observed her in silence, gradually could not help but take notice. Lucy was always the first to hand in her assignments, always asked intelligent questions, and always stayed after class to review her lessons. One day, he called her into his office. "Do you know that you are the most outstanding student in the school?" he asked. Lucy's eyes widened in disbelief. Mr. Matthew smiled. "A rare occurrence. You are not only brilliant, but you also have a determination that few possess. I have written a recommendation letter for you. This is a full scholarship to a prestigious medical school in New York." Lucy was speechless. Her hands trembled as she held the letter. The red seal, the name of the school, and congratulatory words. It was all real. For the first time in her life, Lucy burst into tears. Not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming emotion. She whispered, "Have I truly broken free from the curse, Grandma Rose? I have done it." That night, Lucy couldn't sleep. She sat gazing at the moonlight streaming through the cracked window, clutching the letter to her heart. Her life was about to begin a new chapter, and this time, no one could take it away from her. With extraordinary perseverance and a heart scarred yet unyielding, Lucy stepped out of the shadows of prejudice toward the light of a future she herself had built from nothing. Many years had passed since Lucy left the village that once expelled her in disgrace. Now, she had become one of America's leading reconstructive surgeons. Her name appeared in prestigious medical journals, and major television programs hailed her talent and extraordinary journey. Lucy was not only famous for her exceptional skills, but also for performing life-changing surgeries on hundreds of patients, people who, like her in the past, had been cast aside by society. One special evening, Lucy was honored at the prestigious Golden Hands Awards, which celebrate doctors with outstanding contributions in the field of medicine. The entire auditorium rose to applaud as the MC solemnly announced, "Congratulations, Dr. Lucy Aldridge." Under the dazzling lights, Lucy stepped onto the stage with confidence and grace. The deep navy gown she wore accentuated the strength and gentleness of her character. Her eyes shone radiantly with no trace left of the painful past. Meanwhile, in the old village, where she was once born and shunned, a small cafe was broadcasting the ceremony live. The villagers gathered as usual, none expecting to face a shock. When the MC read Lucy's name, her image appeared on the large screen, and the entire cafe fell silent. An elderly woman gasped in astonishment. "Isn't that cursed child?" Mrs. Marissa's mouth dropped open. Her face turned ashen. "It can't be. Is that really her?" Everyone was stunned. No one could believe their eyes. The one they had once cast out and cursed now stood atop the pinnacle of acclaim. At the Aldridge mansion, the atmosphere was no longer as opulent as before. Richard, once a powerful noble, had become completely bankrupt due
due to poor investment decisions. Wealth, reputation, and influence all had vanished. Isabella, the once proud lady, now lived in isolation in a gloomy room, clinging only to the decaying remnants of the past, deceiving herself into believing that her family was still glorious. Anthony, who had once been the pride of the family, was now afflicted with a rare skin disease that severely deformed his face. No doctor could cure him. Once the most handsome and arrogant man in the village, every time he looked in the mirror now, he only saw a distorted reflection of failure and regret. With nowhere else to turn, Anthony decided to seek out Lucy, the very person he had once trampled on without mercy. He arrived at the hospital where she worked, disheveled, his face covered by a hat and scarf. His voice trembled as he spoke to the receptionist. "I would like to see Dr. Lucy Aldridge. I am her brother." The nurse frowned, but eventually relayed his message. A few minutes later, Lucy appeared in her white lab coat. She stopped in front of Anthony, her eyes calm and cold. She hardly recognized the disheveled man before her. Anthony stammered, "Lucy, I need help. My face. Only you can save me." Lucy looked at him for a long time. She remembered everything, the harsh words, the shoves, the way he and the entire village had treated her like trash. But now, Lucy was no longer the pitiful girl she once was. Standing before Anthony, she remained unnervingly composed. In a soft yet resounding voice, she said, "I will save you, not because I forgive you, but because I refuse to become a monster like you and your parents." Anthony choked on his words. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. Yet Lucy turned her back and walked away. To her, Anthony was now just another patient, no more, no less. The surgery for Anthony was successful. The wound on his face healed somewhat, but the scars deeply etched in his soul could never be erased. From that day on, Anthony lived quietly, avoiding every gaze, especially from Lucy. He no longer had the courage to face the woman whom he once looked down upon, once trampled upon without any humanity. Whenever he saw her walking in the hospital corridor, her calm demeanor and haughty gaze, Anthony would only lower his head in silence. To him, Lucy had now become an untouchable symbol. Richard and Isabella, those who once called her a disgrace, now no longer had the right to utter the word daughter. They had lost everything: property, power, and above all, the hearts of people. They once had the world in their hands, but had lost the most precious thing because of prejudice and arrogance. Now, they live in a darkness of their own creation. Forgotten by society, their consciences gnawed at day by day. During a prestigious award ceremony held a few months later, Lucy continued to be honored. When the host invited her to speak, the entire audience fell silent. Lucy stepped onto the stage, the spotlight shining directly on her calm yet powerful face. She looked straight at the rows of seats and spoke clearly. "I was once a child who was called a curse. I was once expelled from the place where I was born. I was once beaten, chased away, and regarded as a monster. But I survived, not to take revenge, but to prove that true beauty does not lie in the face, but in the heart." The auditorium erupted in resounding applause. People stood up cheering, tears streaming down many faces, moved by the struggle for survival and the forgiveness of someone who had once been completely rejected. At the same time, in the old village, the sound of applause emanating from an old TV in a coffee shop caused those who had once humiliated Lucy to lower their heads in silence. No one dared to look directly at the screen anymore. Late regret was evident on their faces, but Lucy no longer needed apologies. She had gone so far that no one could drag her back into the dark past. Lucy had forgiven, not because they deserved it, but because she deserved peace. And more importantly, because she had proven that kindness and perseverance are what truly determine a person's fate, not the gaze of others. Years later, when Lucy's name had spread throughout America, those who had once heartlessly rejected her had to live with the consequences of their own making. Richard Aldridge, the man who once arrogantly ordered his own blood and flesh,
to be discarded like garbage, now spent his final years in isolation and disgrace, no longer powerful, no longer wealthy, and with no one to respect him. The gossip about him was no longer admiration, but contempt. He lived in a dark room, silently counting the days, haunted by the fact that he had lost the only daughter he should have protected. Isabella, who once proudly sipped tea on a silk chair in a luxurious mansion, had now become nothing more than a shadow of the past. She lived alone in an empty mansion, each wall echoing the sounds of irreparable mistakes. Those who once surrounded her had now turned their backs, leaving just as she had once turned her back on her newborn daughter. No one remembered Isabella. She existed like a living ghost, forgotten by society. Anthony, the golden boy of yesteryear, though his face had been healed, the reflection in the mirror was that of a failed man. He could not erase the memory of his cruel actions, nor the challenging yet pained gaze of Lucy from the past. Every time he saw his restored face, he felt no relief but only pain, because he knew that it was Lucy, the one he once trampled upon, who had saved him, and he would never again have the courage to look her in the eyes. Lucy harbored no resentment. She did not need revenge, for fate had done that for her, by making those people live in the very pain they once sowed. The greatest punishment sometimes is not the loss of material wealth, but the torment in one's soul, when one must witness the person they despised rise more brilliantly than anyone else. And Lucy, she had triumphed, not through acts of vengeance, but through the light of resilience, kindness, and wisdom. She lived in freedom, unbound by prejudice. She lived in success, not material success, but success written by her own hands, from tears, blood, and countless lonely nights that seemed insurmountable. Lucy rewrote her own destiny, page by page, without relying on anyone, without needing anyone's pity. And she did it, for she never gave up. In a final speech before thousands of medical students, Lucy left a message that silenced the entire auditorium before it burst into applause. The value of a person does not lie in the face, circumstances, or judgment, but in resilience, kindness, and the ability to shape one's own destiny. That was not just a conclusion. It was a declaration of life, a reminder to all of us that no one has the right to decide who you are except yourself, that no matter how dark your origins, you can still step into the light if you do not give up kindness and the desire to live a meaningful life. Do you find Lucy's story inspiring? Have you ever been judged because of your appearance or circumstances? Please share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like and share this video so that even more people can be filled with hope. We cherish every bit of support, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story, where light always finds its way out of darkness.